Reporting from Arkham Asylum, this is Gotham Rogues. In this video, we take a look at the Batman the Animated Series episode, Heart of Ice. Heart of Ice, the debut of Mr. Freeze on the animated series, was directed by Bruce Timm and written by Paul Dini. In the episode, there's a new supervillain in town, going by the name Mr. Freeze. This frosty character is responsible for several attacks on GothCorp's buildings, where he's been stealing various components for a giant ice cannon. Freeze is going to use this weapon to get revenge on the president of GothCorp, Ferris Boyle, the man who ruined his life. Batman later learns that Freeze is actually Dr. Victor Freeze, a cryogenicist who used to work for Boyle. Victor had a wife named Nora who was suffering from an incurable genetic disease, and in a desperate attempt to save her, Freeze froze the woman, putting her in suspended animation, where she would stay until Victor could find a cure. To conduct these experiments, he used GothCorp resources without permission, and eventually Boyle marched down to his lab with a security team in tow. Victor was ordered to unplug Nora and end his experiments, which he refused, and so a fight ensued, ending with the doctor getting drenched in cryoliquids and his wife seemingly dying. Victor then became Mr. Freeze, a cold man unable to survive in above 0 degrees. Suited in a powerful refrigerated cryo outfit and armed with a cold gun, Victor initiated his plans of vengeance upon Boyle. I've talked about this episode so much that it kinda feels like I've already reviewed it. As such, there's gonna be a lot of repetition. Heart of Ice is of course known for completely reinventing the character of Mr. Freeze, a villain who was pretty much considered to be B-list. At the time of the making of Heart of Ice, Freeze was even dead in the comics, having been unceremoniously killed off the year before by the Joker in a Tim Drake Robin miniseries. Now there's a comic I really want to review. Freeze, who didn't even have a real name in the comics, that's another credit that goes to this episode. This wasn't an interesting character. What was his origin again? He was a criminal who tried to invent a freeze gun, and while doing so, the clumsy idiot dropped a vial of ice chemicals on himself, which turned him into Mr. Freeze, or Mr. Zero as he originally called himself. Fitting name for such a loser. There's only one single story pre-TAS that portrayed the villain as an interesting character, and that's of course Len Wein's There'll Be a Cold Time in the Old Town Tonight from 1978. That comic features a Freeze that kinda resembles this one, namely a rogue motivated by love for a woman. I wonder if Paul Dini didn't draw some inspiration from that comic. Anyway, along comes Heart of Ice, and the boring supervillain who usually wanted nothing more but the free stuff was now suddenly the most tragic bad guy in Gotham City's history, a man who lost his beloved wife and as a result also his humanity. The ice theme now played into Freeze's personality too, as he was a cold man unable to feel anything. I really can't stress enough of how important this episode was to the character. Without it, Freeze would be nothing. The Mr. Freeze we know today wouldn't even exist. Maybe he even would have stayed dead in the comics and only been remembered for his appearances on the 60s TV show. Of course, then we wouldn't have gotten the Arnie version, so I suppose you have to take the good with the bad. Speaking of the bad, while this episode is amazing and did save the character, it did also in a way ruin him. There's just no way to top Heart of Ice, no matter how hard they try. We've gotten some good stuff with Freeze, both in the comics and in other media, but none of it even gets close to this episode. It almost feels redundant and meaningless to tell another Freeze story after this one. Another thing it did was kill the character's longevity. What motivations do you use to bring him back? All he cared about was Nora, so why would Freeze be up to any other supervillain shenanigans? It just doesn't make any sense. You can really only tell 2 or 3 good stories with this Freeze, and TAS already did that. The episode Deep Freeze and the animated spin-off movie Sub-Zero form a pretty good trilogy for the character. What more is there to say about him? It's already been done. I say he should be reinvented once again. As great of an addition as Nora was, I think you have to drop her. Maybe you could instead focus on Victor's handicap, not being able to survive in above 0 degrees. It's a so-called power that isn't actually a power, but a horrible curse. It may not be as good of a version as the TAS one, but it might reinvigorate the guy. Nobody can ever take away how great Heart of Ice is anyway. It will always be the Mr. Freeze, the greatest story ever told with the character, and that really isn't an overstatement. Whenever I think of Freeze, it's Heart of Ice that comes to my mind, and I think it's the same for almost everyone. Either that or they think of the ice puns of Batman and Robin. Those two things have become synonymous with the character, kind of an odd contrast. Michael Ansara, a TV actor known for numerous different roles, voiced Mr. Freeze, and I'd say his performance is almost as important as the writing. His robotic, monotone voice with a hint of sadness is how everybody imagines Freeze sounds. Just like this new origin made a huge impact, so did the voice. Even when I read old comics from before TAS, I still hear Ansara's voice in my head as I read Freeze's lines. It's a perfect voice that excellently conveys both the cold, emotionless side of the character as well as a tragic one. I also have to mention mention the Mr. Freeze musical theme by Shirley Walker, another aspect of this episode that's kinda become synonymous with Freeze. It's a theme I hear whenever I think of the character, and it's probably the same for most people. A very sad tune with a feeling of winter. Everything in this episode really comes together perfectly, including the visual redesign by Mike Mignola. It's like lightning in a bottle, I suppose. It's so perfect and so definitive that it's impossible to recreate. On a side note, Mark Hamill, who of course voiced the Joker, also did the voice for Ferris Boyle. It's a fine performance, but I gotta wonder why he did it. Boyle isn't exactly a fascinating or demanding role. It feels like anyone could have done it. It's kinda funny how his Ferris voice is so different from his Joker. There's only in one place where they sound a bit similar, and you hear the clown prince of crime in Hamill's delivery. In conclusion, Heart of Ice is the best Mr. Freeze will ever be, and next to the Two-Face two-parter, it's the best villain origin story the show ever produced. Actually, not just this show, but any cartoon show. Next up on TAS Reviews is another villain origin story, namely Clayface's, as we take a look at Feet of Clay Part 1 and 2, so stay tuned for that. And as always, remember, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.